It often begins with a phone call, claiming to be from your bank, or the police, someone you're supposed to trust. They may already know personal things about you, and their aim is to persuade you to act quickly to transfer money or sensitive information. Increasingly, scam calls are not coming from just one person. They're part of an entire operation. Across Eurasia, scam centers are operating as part of organized crime networks and recruiting workers to follow structured methods. These scams take many different forms, but are engineered to build trust, create urgency, and extract money, targeting victims across borders. The Global Anti-Scam Alliance estimates that scammers stole more than $1 trillion in 2024. That's almost 1% of the global GDP. In Ukraine alone, tens of thousands of people are believed to be working in scam call centers. But the people making the calls are only part of the picture. Behind them sits a network of actors and tools, transnational criminal groups, leaked data, crypto platforms, and money mules, all working together to enable scams at scale. And this is part of a wider shift. The Global Organized Crime Index shows financial crime as the most prevalent criminal market globally, scoring 6.21 out of 10 in 2025. Of the markets measured by the index, it is also the fastest growing since 2023, with new technologies, including artificial intelligence, expected to further increase both the scale and sophistication of this global phenomenon. So how do these operations actually work? Who's behind them? And why has Eurasia become such a key region for this type of organized crime? To discuss this, I'm joined by Brian Lee, the head of program for the Observatory of Illicit Economies in Eurasia at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Brian, thank you for joining me. Now, can you start off by walking us through what a typical scam center looks like in Eurasia, how they're structured, and how they operate day to day?
I think it's important to start out how they're structured by looking at sort of the 5 key findings we found from recent research. The first one being that they do use a common toolbox with similar approaches, but then how they operate can vary depending on the local circumstances. There's also, as we've seen, there's also expanding scam activity due to transnational networks, as well as local enablers that help with financial issues or communication issues. We also see, I think, which is key to the region, is also the exploitation of geopolitical fault lines that have really come to the fore over the past 4+ years with the Russo-Ukrainian war. And then also sort of the relationships there, and both within the region, but also with countries that are being, their population are being victims, and how they cooperate with countries in Eurasia or they don't. And I think another key thing there too is just also looking at the criminal benefits of government practices, governance, then also corruption in the region, which we'll get into a bit further. And then also, I think, as you mentioned earlier, how is AI and technology being used to both perpetuate and then also sort of advance how these scams are being done and making them more effective. So I think that's sort of the larger themes that we've seen in the trends. And as far as how they operate on a day-to-day basis, they do, in most cases, operate with a strict hierarchy. Sense of, you have those sort of initial stages with cold callers, moving to those who close. And then, you move on to your HR team, your IT, your security, and your administrative or your management. So in many ways, it is for all intents and purposes, it looks very similar to upfront illicit call center. And I think another thing to look at there too is many of them are opening or you're operating openly, but also in a secure manner. They're highly networked, as mentioned earlier. There's largely, there's a criminal aspect to that. But then at the same point, I think you need to understand, look at the local variations. So, for example, I think you'd say the hotbeds where you're seeing sort of high level of these operating is in Georgia, Russia, and Ukraine. And with we do see some operations in Central Asia through Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, but to a lower extent. And then also, looking at as things have changed over the years, we've seen them also pop up in Moldova and Armenia.
Once a scam is successful, how does the money move from the victim to the wider criminal network?
I mean, that's a good question, especially with looking at illicit finance and how the money moves. Whereas previously scams were based on the telephone is very, say, analog. And now with the introduction of not just AI, but also going back several years, tech, and also in the region, the internet usage, also electronic payments and transactions. I would say there's sort of two main ways that they'll start to move the money. First off is once they sort of whisk the money away, one way or the other, it can either then be moved from, I would say, kind of going through the traditional banking system, of which they'll have a number of different nodes, which as you mentioned earlier, money mules, or droppers that are sort of directed, and they might know what they're doing. They might have a number of accounts they use for this and they kind of earn a little bit off the top, or it might just be sort of they might be victims themselves, and their accounts are just being moved to move the money, and then they whisk it off and use it how they want to through traditional money laundering and shell companies and the like, into accounts, offshore accounts and in different places around the world. The second way of doing that, and it also then ends up in the scammer's hands, is the introduction of digital coins and cryptocurrencies. And in many ways, that can be very quick, and even I mean, it is quicker in many ways than the traditional banking system. Easier to cross borders, as we've seen in the region as well. And you also have, in the South Caucasus, and not just there, but also in the region, cryptocurrency is widely used. And so it then goes through a mixer, it tries to sort of look at, hide where it's come from, where it's going to, and things along those lines.
I mean, it sounds both fascinating and terrifying. These, new technologies are enabling these criminal networks. Who are these scam centers targeting?
I think that's the interesting thing when you're looking at the post-Soviet space, is because most of the time when we've been doing research across both Southeast Asia, but also widely globally in here, I mean, it's obviously you're trying to go after people that have money. So you're looking at the wider West, say some people would say the global North, into Europe as well. But also within the region, Russia is still a common language, and that's used to the scammer's advantage as well. So you do have a, a fairly large, high level of scamming and victims within the region itself.
What about the people who work in these places? What draws them to this kind of environment?
It varies, but I think one of the key things between we've seen in the region is people more or less go work in these willingly. And there was openly advertisements across social media, Telegram being a prominent one. We were talking to people in different countries they were talking to people that had been recruited or gone through the recruitment process. It was the money, and so they'll target those with certain skills, such as in cases IT skills, obviously, but also with language skills, and those that have, for example, possibly lived in these countries or might have family in these countries that they're targeting, and so they're going after highly skilled labor, and they're also offering, at least initially, salaries that are far higher than what most of these would make on an average monthly salary. So in some cases, we're told, for example, in Ukraine, it could be initially 3 to 4 times, or even in Georgia, it could be even larger. And even some of the higher money makers are making, you know, 20, upwards of 20, sometimes even 30,000 a month at a time when they're kind of doing very, very well. So I think if that's the initial draw is the money, and I think that a lot of times that's what keeps them there. So there's not really the practice of people being trafficked into this. They more or less willingly go into it.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you said about human trafficking because obviously we've heard a lot about scam centers in Southeast Asia, right? And these are often linked to human trafficking. Could you perhaps sort of compare and contrast how the operations in Eurasia are different in that sense?
I think one of the big things when you're looking at Southeast Asia, one of the things that always comes up, it's not just looking at how large the scam centers are and sort of who they're targeting and the amount of money coming out. But one of the key factors is always looking at the human aspect, the human trafficking aspect of who is working there. And I think when you're looking at Eurasia, that is one of the distinct differences, is that people more or less willingly, that we've seen and that looking through and doing the research, the field work, and talking to people is they willingly go and work there. They advertise on social media, large, through Telegram. It's largely across the region, and so people will go and work there, and they're lured there. Say lured, I mean they're attracted by, in many cases, it's the money. And if they're younger, they want to live a certain lifestyle, or if you're living in a country where the average wage is say $800 to $1,000 a month, if not less. If you can make 4 or 5 times that amount, of course you're going to.
Yeah, I can see how attractive such a proposition could be, particularly, I guess, like you said, in Eurasia, where there are conflicts going on and, right, there are all these issues around livelihoods. But what about in terms of if people do want to leave that work? Are there any consequences? Can they leave these jobs?
That's a good question. And I think that's where there are some difficulties that we've seen. And once people are in, and the further along they go, and especially if they're good at their job, um, it is then more difficult for them to leave. They are pressured to stay in, and things along those lines. For example, that was something that we saw in Ukraine when we were doing work there, but also, for example, in Georgia, we were talking to people. It's then more sort of a regular job. You can kind of come and go as you please. It's also easy to switch between different call centers if you'd like to, especially if it's the same under the same sort of management, as you could say. Um, but I'd say there are sometimes we were told that there are difficulties once you try to leave. And I think that is one thing um, to take into account. But I also think that's in many cases is also typical of say criminal organizations. Once you're in, you're in, and then if you try to get out, there is a price to pay.
Can you tell us what's being done to tackle these operations across Eurasia?
It varies, and I think it really depends on looking at a case by case basis. I think that really is a good question because of the geopolitical fault lines that we see and how countries are engaging with each other, especially when you're looking at law enforcement cooperation, how you carry out investigations, and who's willing to actually enter into conversation with one another and even start that process. So, for example, you have had some successful cross-border cooperation in the region, for example, looking at Belarus, Russia, and then the Central Asian countries in the past couple of years, where they have managed to shut down some transnational operations. So, in many ways, you would consider that a success. However, on the flip side of that, you see a breakdown of relationships and cooperation between law enforcement bodies, and especially when you're looking at Ukraine and Russia. And so you have Russians scamming Ukrainians and vice versa because as they say, nobody's going to come for us. And in the same sense as well, you have when you're looking at Western countries, European countries, there is still that lack of law enforcement cooperation with Russia as well. So in many senses, they are being victims on that. There are efforts being undertaken, but it really is looking at a case by case basis of what is being done.
To what extent are things like, political factors, corruption, or protection structures enabling these operations?
To answer that question, you have to look at sort of the history of the region as a whole and sort of the criminal ecosystem in the region over the past decades. It's not sort of a snapshot in time of what has happened here, because I think it's common knowledge by pretty much mostly anyone that's looked into these issues is that, I mean, even going back into the Soviet times, that criminal organizations and criminal activity was allowed to take place, but it happened under the protection of the state with somebody taking a cut, and that still happens. And when these operations are running smoothly, they're running smoothly, and there's sort of no hiccups in this along the lines. But there are times I think that where it isn't, and I think that's when you really start to see, okay, something is going on. Somebody's paying somebody off, or they didn't pay the right person off, or this, that, the other. And those are the cases that typically make the news. So how is this enabling? I think it's still like it does in a way any other criminal activity in the region. But I think when you start looking at from country to country, it does vary. So, for example, in our research, certain countries such as Armenia and the Central Asian countries, it wasn't something that came up when we were talking to people. It wasn't something that they noticed was taking place. Difference in Ukraine and Georgia, for example. But I think you also have to take that into account with it. what's being inferred and what can you actually prove.
Now, you mentioned Georgia, and that's one of the things that your research highlights, right? There's this case of Milton Limited in Georgia. Can you tell us a little bit about that and also what that example tells us about how these networks operate?
Limited, that came out. I think this was the interesting thing that we saw coming into Georgia was one of the first hotspots for scam centers, scam call centers in the region, and some of that came up from Israel as well, where this had been it's a scam center that started off in the mid 2000s. And then, there were some changes in legislation and different reasons. And it wasn't just from Israel, but where it started in the region, but it did come up into Georgia. And one of the groups that came out of this was Milton Limited and Milton Group. And yeah, they've been operating for several years in Georgia. And I think you should mention the recent case. And I think it's interesting there because we talked about cross-border cooperation and steps to clamp down on these operations. So I think this is one example that really does highlight successful cross-border cooperation and kind of shows what can be done. We're looking at our research. The global losses of their operation over the years when they were active from Georgia was at least, or give or take, 180 million euros, which is quite sizable. And in Germany alone, it was, you know, double digits, if I'm mistaken, it was around 10 million. Whether or not this can be replicated is another question. I think that's also something to keep in mind as you're looking at this case. Well, it is one success, and let's chalk it up to that. I think it's also an example and possibly a model that could be replicated of what went well here, and how could we avoid a breakdown in relations, or how can we maintain good relations moving forward, because it does impact not just people in Georgia, but it also impacts people elsewhere in Germany.
The Global Organized Crime Index found that financial crimes are now the most prevalent and fastest growing criminal market globally, right? Can you tell us, where do scam centers fit and where do they sit within that? And why are they such an effective model for organized crime?
It's an interesting one, and this is, I think, one of the reasons that we started looking into it, is because it does sort of combine a number of different crime types. So you still have some of your analog crime types there but it's very much moving into a tech-enabled and sort of AI-enabled, and how they're going to use that moving forward. And so there's a lot of different strings to pull at. Um, and so I think that's also an interesting looking down the road of how do you actually approach this. So there's different nodes that you can look at there. But when it's looking at financial crime, I mean, in many ways, it's the leading edge of how are you using fintech? What tools are you using within this space? You mentioned digital coins and cryptocurrency earlier, and that's only part of it. But how are they utilizing even the traditional banking sector, and what the tools that are coming out there? It's sort of a petri dish in some ways. You could say both within the criminal ecosystem and then looking within the financial crime of how are people using tools? What are best case scenarios? How do they not want to use them again? Because that went bust. And I think the other interesting thing to look there as well is it's also a way, it is what we've seen, at least in the Eurasia region. It's one of the most profitable criminal markets as well, which increasingly is going to probably, remain there within that hierarchy, especially as these scam centers change, how they're engaging with their victims, the type of scams or the types of activities that they're carrying out.
Thank you, Brian, for joining me on this episode of the Index. The Global Organized Crime Index is a totally free resource and is available to everyone. If you'd like to learn more, head over to ocindex.net. This is Thinlowin. Thank you for watching.